Bom dia, Mariana. O quarteirão continua todo cercado por policiais militares. Nós estamos afastados por orientação da polícia. Deste ponto aqui, é possível avistar apenas a janela onde, neste momento, o rapaz se encontra com as duas adolescentes.
It's Tuesday, October 14th, 2008. As television crews arrive on the scene of an unfolding news event occurring in São Paulo, Brazil, a camera is trained up at the third-story apartment unit where two young girls are being held captive. The ordeal was already developing into one of the longest hostage situations the area had ever seen, as it now entered its 18th grueling hour. However, there was optimism at the time, as negotiations between the hostage taker and law enforcement were ongoing, and the local news station speculated that they would soon be covering a peaceful resolution to this episode, though they couldn't have been more wrong. Instead, this single news report was merely the first domino to fall, leading to a chain reaction unlike anything we've ever seen in the world of television. As little did this news station and all the others en route to cover this impasse know, but they would have a say in how this story ends. This is the story of the Eloá Pimentel hostage incident, or as it's since come to be known, the darkest moment in television history.
Aproveitar esse momento que a gente sabe que os três estão assistindo.
Lindenberg, somos amigo da família.
Eu queria falar pra minha mãe que eu amo ela, e meu pai também.
Before we fully dive down this rabbit hole, I want to give a major thank you to today's sponsor, Beam. For most of my life, I've struggled with sleeping. Whether that be falling asleep or staying asleep, it feels like I'm never waking up feeling fully refreshed, which always seems to negatively affect my mood and my ability to focus while I'm working. I've even tried sleep supplements in the past, but none of them ever really seemed to do the trick until I tried Beam's Dream Powder. This is a healthy hot cocoa mix scientifically formulated to help you get the best night's sleep possible. And not only does it taste good, but it's really worked for me, as I noticed myself getting tired much faster than usual, and I haven't been waking up nearly as often in the middle of the night. Because of this, I'm waking up feeling more refreshed than usual, and I'm not feeling nearly as groggy as I did when I tried those other sleeping aids. In fact, every once in a while, I'm actually starting to wake up before my alarm for once. I can't talk enough about how important getting good sleep is, as it leads to better focus, more energy, improved mood, and of course, less stress, which I think we can all use. Beam's Dream Powder has become a staple in my nighttime routine, as it's genuinely been a game changer when it comes to improving my quality of sleep. Beam even went through a clinical study which showed that 93% of participants reported that Dream helped them get better sleep. So if this sounds like something that you might be interested in, go to shopbeam.com/Nick Crowley or scan the QR code to start shopping Beam's biggest sale with up to 50% off their products. Don't miss out on this limited time offer. The discounts are all auto-applied, so no codes necessary, and I hope that you guys enjoy it as much as I do. It was a warm, muggy Monday afternoon. Most residents across São Paulo had been busy starting off their work week as 15-year-old Eloá Cristina Pimentel arrived home from school for the day. Best described as a fun-loving, good-natured kid, Eloá excelled in her studies, where she met her closest friend, Nayara de Silva. And as she entered her family's apartment that day, she did so with Nayara by her side, as well as two other male friends, Legaio Viala de Oliveira and Victor de la Compass, with a group gathering together to work on a school project, until they heard the sound of rustling at the door. By this point, Eloá's parents Ana and Aldo had been busy at work, while her brother Douglas had stayed after school, meaning that the sound they had just heard couldn't have come from either of them, with Eloá's confusion quickly turning to fear as the door was pushed in and then broke completely open, revealing the source of the sound. Standing there was 22-year-old Lindenberg Fernandez Alves, a man who Eloá had come to know all too well. Almost 3 years before, the then 12-year-old Eloá had caught the eye of Lindenberg, who at that time was already 19 years old. Though despite this glaring age gap, the two would fall in love with each other and proceed to date for the next 2 years and 7 months, a period of time that was anything but smooth sailing. By this point, Lindenberg had become well known locally for his temper, with most describing him as a hothead and incredibly aggressive, which Eloá would come to realize firsthand, as he quickly grew jealous of seemingly anything and everything Eloá would do without him. On one occasion, Lindenberg had even stalked Eloá when she was out for a walk, following her every movement across town before he'd eventually catch her sitting alone at the bus stop. This, for whatever reason, enraged him, and he would go on to confront her both verbally and physically, with it being reported that Lindenberg had attacked her not only on this occasion, but likely on several others as well. And after over 2.5 years of dating, Eloá had finally had enough, recognizing that Lindenberg couldn't be fixed, or at least not by her, and so she broke up with him. But this was something that Lindenberg just couldn't accept, as in his mind, life without Eloá was no life at all, and he had to do something about it. Now, Lindenberg stood in the doorway facing the girl who had broke his heart just months before, with his pistol pointed directly at her. Eloá immediately screamed, but was silenced by Lindenberg, who slapped her across the face, before going on to express frustration towards the other 3 in the group as they weren't supposed to be there. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, and yet he claimed that this would not spare them from his wrath. He was there to kill Eloá and himself, and anyone else who might stand in his way. Though he seemed to be in no rush to do so, as he forced the 4 teenagers onto a bed and forbade any of them from talking, before he would stand there and wait for hours weighing his options. Until he too heard the sound of rustling at the door. It was Aldo, Eloá's father, who had arrived home from work only to find Eloá's brother Douglas sitting outside the front door. Douglas had gotten home over an hour before, only to find the door locked and the inside deathly quiet, forcing him to wait for his father to arrive home with the keys, all the while having no inclination that inside, his own sister was being held at gunpoint. As Aldo approached the door, Lindenberg would begin yelling, shouting at him to back away and that he had his daughter and her friends inside, marking the official beginning of the standoff. Police would arrive almost immediately to the scene, where they would quickly realize just how daunting the task before them was. Lindenberg was more unwell than they could have ever imagined, with his temper proving to be their biggest obstacle during that first day, as in some instances he was actually receptive to negotiations, even allowing the release of the 2 boys inside, before he would suddenly shut down and become enraged, seemingly out of nowhere.
O que você quer? Fala pra mim pra eu poder te ajudar, cara.
Eu quero matar Eloá e matar e liberar a base. Você tá agredindo a minha namorada, essa desgraçada aqui. Qual é a namorada? Cala a boca.
At one point, he even fired a shot through the front door at a passing civilian, incorrectly believing that they were trying to interfere. One minute he was hot, and the next he was cold. And as these tense minutes turned to hours, the reality of the situation for these negotiators became apparent. One wrong statement, even one wrong word, could cause everything to come crashing down. It was a fragile ordeal, and the following day, these negotiations would only become more complicated.
E a gente vai falar agora de um caso de violência que está acontecendo neste momento em Santo André, no ABC Paulista. Um jovem mantém a ex-namorada e a amiga dela reféns.
A polícia cercou o conjunto habitacional onde estão os reféns e a repórter Graciela Andrade está lá no local. Conta pra gente qual é a situação nesse momento, Graciela.
During the local 7 a.m. news that following morning, the first reporter would arrive to the scene to document this developing story. In the footage, we can see the massive police presence and the window of the apartment where Lindenberg was holding the 2 girls. And almost immediately, the story was met with a skyrocketing number of viewers and soaring ratings that producers could only dream of. With this single report, they had just struck television gold, and suddenly other stations and dozens of reporters began flocking to the scene to capture a piece of this unfolding drama in real time. It seemed like in an instant, all of Brazil was now tuned into their TVs and waiting to see what would happen next. And among those viewers was Lindenberg himself. Recognizing that the news was starting to take note of his story, and that the area was now swarming with cameras waiting on his every move, Lindenberg's behavior began to grow more erratic. At one point, he forced Eloá to the window, standing behind her and demanding that she give the cameras a thumbs up, in order to let the people at home know that she was okay, and that Lindenberg wasn't hurting her. Though soon after, he would approach another window, this time holding his revolver, and without warning, begin firing randomly at the street below, in the direction of the news crews. Thankfully, again, no one was hurt by these shots, but it was becoming evident that Lindenberg was almost putting on a show for the cameras, And now that he was feeling like the star of the show, he was growing less and less interested in working with negotiators. And they recognized this too, and knew that they had to do something to force Lindenberg to continue working with them, which led to their decision to cut power to the unit, leaving Lindenberg in the dark, without air conditioning, and unable to watch the television.
Eu ligo, mas vamos conversar.
As a result, Lindenberg went ballistic, striking Eloá while on the phone with negotiators. Though despite his initial reaction, this move actually ended up working, as Nayara was eventually released under the condition that the power be restored, which meant that Lindenberg was now down to just one hostage, the person that he had sought out from the very beginning, and the whole reason he was there. As the sun set on that Tuesday evening and the standoff passed its 40th hour, some remained positive, while others viewed the whole thing as helpless. But whatever opinions those in the area had at the time, it's safe to say that no one could have expected the baffling turn that this case was headed for just the following day. It was 1:30 p.m. on Wednesday the 15th, the third day of Eloá's captivity, when suddenly, inside that quiet apartment building, the silence would be interrupted by the ringing of a telephone. Lindenberg rushed to pick it up, expecting it to be the negotiator who he had been speaking with the previous day, but instead, he heard a different voice.
Lindenberg, tá tudo bem aí?
É.
Oi, Lindenberg, somos um amigo da família, a gente queria saber se tá tudo bem, só isso. Lindenberg, é Luiz Guerra, tudo bem? Somos conhecidos da...
Luiz Guerra.
Sou da Sônia Abrão, repórter da Sônia Abrão, a gente só tá em nome da sua família, porque sua mãe está desesperada, a gente quer saber se tá tudo bem, só isso.
Acting without the permission of the police or Eloá's family, a reporter named Luis Guerra from the Sonia Abreu news station managed to track down the apartment's phone number and call Lindenberg while in the middle of this active hostage situation.
Vocês estão ao vivo aí?
Não, estamos gravando e vai ser exibido na Sônia Abrão tudo o que você falar, tudo. Às 2 horas entra no ar, o que você estiver falando vai ficar no ar.
It's not hard to understand why this is such a terrible idea, as we already know that Lindenberg was highly emotional and could be set off on a rampage with just a single word. And yet, Luis had called anyway, and he was clearly unprepared to handle an interview of this magnitude, as he nervously starts by first lying to Lindenberg, claiming to be a friend of his family, before eventually revealing that he was actually a reporter, and that their phone conversation would be played for the world to hear. Throughout this nearly 8-minute-long phone call, Luis would push things further and further, even at one point speaking directly to Eloá.
Alô?
Oi, Eloá, Luiz Guerra da Sônia Abrão, tudo bem?
Quem tá falando?
Luiz Guerra, repórter da Sônia Abrão, tudo bem com você?
Tá tudo tranquilo. Eu quero almoçar.
Você quer almoçar?
Eu tô fraca.
Fica tranquila, eu conversei com o Lindenberg, a gente vai conversar de novo. Ele tá te tratando bem?
Tá me tratando bem.
Who sounds weak and exhausted as she sends a message to her family telling them that she loves them.
Olha, você tá precisando mandar um recado pra sua mãe, alguma coisa?
Eu queria saber como ela tá, como meus familiares estão.
Tá tudo bem com eles, tá tudo tranquilo.
Um beijo da minha mãe pro meu pai.
Pode fazer uma...
Com eles.
Pode falar de novo, mande um beijo de novo.
Eu queria falar pra minha mãe que eu amo ela. Pro meu pai também. Eu amo ele.
And in what might be the worst moment of the entire call, Luis accidentally speaks over her at one point, before his producer clearly tells him to get her to repeat that line, in a shameless attempt at getting a good soundbite for their story.
Tá tudo tranquilo.
Um beijo da minha mãe pro meu pai.
Pode fazer uma...
Com eles.
Pode falar de novo, mande um beijo de novo.
Luis's stunt was indescribably unprofessional, as he had inserted himself into hostage negotiations that he was utterly unprepared to take on. And though his words didn't immediately lead to any escalations from Lindenberg, the effects of this interview were nothing shy of devastating. Just 1 day prior, Lindenberg had seen his work on TV for the very first time. And now, with this interview, it fully sank in just how important he was. For the first time in his life, all eyes were on him. He was the main character of the biggest story transpiring in all of Brazil. And now, he was inspired to write another chapter. From here, Lindenberg would continue his antics at the window, using these opportunities to interact with the cameras and hold the media's attention, while using Eloá as a human shield to prevent police snipers from firing at him. As at one point, he forces her to use tied-together sheets to lift up food from negotiators below. All the while, he's looming ominously behind her. And this wasn't solely for the cameras either, as by this point, the audience wasn't just watching at home, but many had gathered outside the apartment to watch the action unfold in person, treating it like some sort of public spectacle. And all while this was happening, police were trying desperately to continue their negotiations. But by this point, Lindenberg was far too distracted by all this attention, as he would even hop onto another live interview shortly after.
Todos os amigos estão dizendo, o pessoal que te conhece também está falando que você sempre foi calmo, sempre foi trabalhador, sempre foi um cara legal, que o que você está fazendo hoje deve ser um surto que você está passando, uma crise emocional muito séria. Mas você, de qualquer maneira, mesmo em crise, você está se segurando, você está fazendo as coisas com um certo critério, você está liberando as pessoas, você não está fazendo mal para ninguém. Então, já dá um final para essa história que seja todo mundo são e salvo, inclusive você, inclusive você.
While on air, the host herself didn't just ask Lindenberg questions, but she began actively trying to negotiate Eloá's release, despite again having no authority and no training for this kind of event.
Tá, você vai entregar os 2 revólveres para ela, você vai tirar as balas, entregar na mão da Eloá.
Exatamente, mas eu não vou dar a hora e não vou falar qual que vai ser o momento.
Tudo bem, mas você vai descer e a gente vai deixar isso aqui claro para o Brasil inteiro. Você está dizendo que você vai descer desarmado, completamente indefeso, com as mãos para cima, ou seja, você vai se render sem nenhuma resistência, para que as coisas terminem em paz. É isso? Confirma para a gente, confirma para o Brasil inteiro isso.
Tá confirmado. Na melhor hora eu vou fazer isso.
It was evident from both interviews that these reporters were not taking this case as seriously as they should be, failing to understand just how violent Lindenberg was, and just how quickly he could become enraged. And if it wasn't obvious just how twisted the media's perception of this case had become, they would then go on to air a segment with their trusted legal consultant, who gave his expert opinion on how he believed this case would end.
Ademar Gomes, né? Vamos falar do que espera o Lindenberg aqui fora. Boa tarde, viu, doutora Ademar? Prazer tê-la aqui novamente. E com a sua experiência nos orientar aí sobre o que vai acontecer daqui pra frente, para que a gente possa ter uma ideia.
Bom,
claro.
Eu sou muito otimista, né? Eu espero que isso termine assim em pizza, né? E num casamento futuro entre ele e a namorada apaixonada dele, né?
Certo.
Ele está passando uma fase momentânea, né? Ele também tem perdido a motivação de viver, porque um rapaz jovem, quando se apaixona, muitas vezes se desequilibra, que é o
radicaliza
caso do...
mesmo, né?
Então, mas isso vai terminar realmente em final feliz, graças a Deus, eu tenho plena certeza.
With the reporter theorizing that this would all end in pizza, with the couple having a meal and reconciling their differences before eventually going on to get married, as this was all just a phase for the young man and his passionate girlfriend. And they somehow made things even worse, as the host would follow this segment up by stating that Lindenberg was still going to have to answer for his crimes, before running down the list of every single charge that he was going to face.
A gente tem a informação que ele vai responder aos crimes de sequestro e invasão de domicílio, disparo e porte ilegal de arma de fogo. Que ele deve ter um alívio na pena porque ele não tem antecedentes criminais, ele é réu primário e a pena para sequestro seria de 1 a 3 anos.
This obviously only made the situation even more helpless in Lindenberg's mind, as she was essentially telling him that no matter what happens from here, even if it were to all end peacefully, his life was already essentially over based on the crimes he had already committed. And this wasn't the only thing his TV was telling him. As mentioned previously, these news crews were on the scene 24/7, watching and listening to everything that the police were doing all the while. And as a result, they would overhear officers discussing their plans on how they were going to attempt to end the situation. To which, incredibly, these stations would proceed to air this information in real time, meaning that everything the police were trying to do to help Eloá would be heard by Lindenberg well before they would attempt to carry it out. And he would see it all too, as due to the constant live coverage outside their window, he would be able to see any officer attempting to approach the door or the windows. The media was not only making Lindenberg feel invincible, but they were quite literally making him untouchable, as whenever the police would make plans, he would hear it on the TV and simply adjust his course to ensure that they wouldn't capture him. Whatever the police said and whatever the police did, Lindenberg was watching over them all the while, and so they had to be extra diligent and avoid doing anything rash to keep the situation stable. But as another long day came to an end, and the sun rose on the fourth morning of this ordeal, they would proceed to do the exact opposite. Following her release from the apartment, Nayara had been recovering in private away from the media, trying her best to grapple with the situation that she had just endured, as well as dealing with the fear of what might happen to her closest friend. However, on the morning of Thursday the 17th, a pair of unexpected visitors would arrive at her home. Standing at her door were two police officers that had been working Eloá's case who requested that Nayara come with them in order to help assist with their negotiations. Apparently, that morning, Lindenberg had agreed to facilitate Eloá's release, but only on the condition that Nayara and Douglas meet the two outside of the apartment and walk with them down into police custody. This was due to the fact that Lindenberg had become paranoid of being shot by officers, but having Nayara and Douglas there would essentially provide a shield for him. And so, the police agreed. But by this point, Nayara had no idea that this deal had ever been made, and that she was now being driven back to the kidnapping site, where she would soon have to meet her captor face to face, yet again. And there was little to no time for her to react upon her arrival, as she was almost immediately thrust into negotiations.
Amor, vou subir. Tá bom, na frente da porta.
Nenhum policial subir, tá bom?
Tá bom.
Nenhum.
Tá, deixa eu falar com ele agora, amor.
Tudo certo.
Vai dar tudo certo, prometi pra você desde o começo, tá bom?
Tá bom.
Beijo, te amo.
Oi, Nayara.
Tudo bom?
Tá melhor já?
Tô, você tá calmo aí?
Tudo calmo.
Você vai fazer mesmo tudo isso que você tá falando?
Você confia em mim?
Confio.
And so, the cameras followed as Nayara and Douglas began their trek up to the home. Though almost immediately, Lindenberg had a change of heart and began yelling to negotiators that he no longer wanted to do this, as he was nervous about Douglas being there, instead insisting that Nayara come up to the unit alone, where he would then open the door and she would take Eloá's hand and the three would walk out together. Based on this behavior, it was obvious that Lindenberg wasn't to be trusted, as he had already backed off the original deal. Plus, part of his deal was that no police officers would be allowed in the building, meaning that there was no backup for Nayara, making the whole thing far too dangerous to even consider. And yet, the negotiators agreed anyway, and gave Nayara the call to walk up those stairs and approach the door alone. And so, with no backup whatsoever, the pressure of her friend's life on her shoulders, the police officers talking in her ear, and the hundreds of thousands of people watching at home, she felt as if she had no choice but to walk up those stairs step by step, until she stood just feet away from the door, where she waited to see Eloá. Though when the door was opened, she was instead met with the sight of Lindenberg, who reached out his arms, grabbed Nayara's hand, and pulled her inside, shutting the door behind them. And with that, Nayara was a hostage once more. This whole sequence has to be one of the worst handlings of a hostage situation that I've ever seen. Even having Nayara at the scene to begin with was questionable enough, as remember, she was only 15 years old at the time, and she had just survived this traumatic experience only one day before. But sending her up there alone, with no form of protection, is shocking. And you might think that after all of this, the news stations would finally just back off and stop intruding on the case, as clearly things were becoming more and more dire. However, they only became more obsessed, as Nayara's recapture only boosted their ratings even higher, and garnered the case a whole new level of notoriety that they just needed to exploit. And so, these reporters began calling the unit repeatedly, doing anything they could in an attempt to speak to Lindenberg. Though even when he wouldn't answer, they would still try to speak to him directly over their broadcast.
Porque a gente podia, quem sabe, aproveitar esse momento que a gente sabe que os três estão assistindo aqui o programa e eles estão bem, que assim que o Lindenberg ele confirmou isso aqui para nossa produção, eles estão bem, estão tranquilos, estão só esperando o momento certo, pedir para uma das meninas, quem sabe, ou ele mesmo, desse um sinal agora aqui na janela para mostrar para todo mundo que está tudo bem, que está ok e que essa história vai acabar o mais rápido que todo mundo espera. Se os três puderem, um deles dar um sinal, acenar, fazer alguma coisa para mostrar para todo mundo, para deixar todo mundo mais calmo.
Instructing him to give specific signals to show that he was hearing them. Both the media and Lindenberg were stretching his 15 minutes of fame for as long as they possibly could. And by that Friday, the ordeal would reach its 100th hour, making it the most prolonged hostage crisis in Brazil's entire history, with there being no sign of a resolution in sight. And it was obvious that this longevity was weighing heavily on Lindenberg, whose fiery persona had eventually turned into despondency as he grew more and more exhausted, with his words alluding to the possibility that he was finally going to snap. And by this point, Brazilian officials were tired of their negotiations anyway, and knew that it was time for a different tactic, sending in their Special Tactical Actions Group, known as GATE. Although, due to the cameras on the scene, the team knew that they couldn't just scale up the wall and enter through the window, since Lindenberg would be able to see the whole thing unfolding on his TV. And anytime he would go to the window, he used Eloá as a human shield, meaning that any plan to shoot him from long range without risking the life of Eloá was nearly impossible. There was really only one way in: the front door, with their plan being to set a charge and breach said door should Lindenberg's behavior escalate, with the camera showing the entirety of the setup. At one point, they even captured the team secretly raising up a gun to one of the officers, despite the officers telling Lindenberg that there were going to be no guns involved, though their cover was clearly blown. And so, the charge was set, and the streets fell silent, as all of Brazil watched on, waiting to see what would happen next.
Na tarde de hoje, documento foi entregue, também colete.
Um minuto ao senhor, doutor.
Nós estamos assistindo ritual, o ritual final desse episódio, o ritual que precede a libertação das duas reféns, das duas adolescentes, e a entrega. Barulho lá no local.
Aconteceu disparo, Percival.
Barulho, exatamente. É barulho de disparo. Houve um disparo lá dentro.
Aconteceu.
Agora foi. Agora foi.
It all happened in the blink of an eye, as in an instant, Gate would blow open the door, which was followed by a puff of smoke and 4 loud gunshots. The scene is hectic for a minute, until suddenly, we see Nayara stumble out of the door, bleeding heavily from her face, where she falls into the arms of an officer. Then, a stretcher is taken into and out of the room, with Eloá strapped to it. As she is rushed down the stairs and taken into an ambulance. And even at this point, these news crews just couldn't help themselves, as they stuck their cameras in the window of that very same ambulance, where rescue workers were desperately trying to save Eloá's life. In the fray, Lindenberg had been struck by a rubber bullet and pulled from the unit where police piled on top of him, thus finally bringing the crisis to an end. But not before he would fire his weapon 3 times. One shot would hit Nayara's hand, with a bullet traveling directly through it and then striking her in the face, while Eloá was struck twice, once in the groin and once directly in the head. Despite being given immediate medical attention, Eloá Pimentel fell into a coma, and though she fought bravely for many days, she was eventually pronounced brain dead, before she would ultimately pass away. Her funeral was held days later, where over 30,000 people would pay their respects for the girl whose kidnapping many had watched on their household TVs. In the days that followed, Nayara would make a full recovery, and she would later go on to speak out about her story and how she was pressured by law enforcement to revisit the scene that day, with her accounts leading to heavy criticism against the officers who were working her case. And it wasn't just for that reason either, as her testimony also exposed just how poorly planned out Gates' entry of the home actually was. According to officials, the team only entered the building because they had heard a gunshot, claiming that Lindenberg had fired first, which prompted them to react. Though it's evident from the footage at the scene and from Nayara's own testimony that this actually wasn't the case, and Lindenberg had only begun shooting as a result of that door being blown open. And making things even more troubling, despite blowing the door open, it took officers as long as 7 to 15 seconds to enter the apartment, a time span in which Lindenberg would fire all 3 of his shots. It's unclear why they hesitated for so long before they entered the home, but they must have known that the blast was going to trigger some sort of reaction from Lindenberg, and their decision not only to breach the door in that manner, but also their decision to wait, undoubtedly contributed to the death of Eloá. And truthfully, it's a miracle that Nayara wasn't killed as well, due to their incompetence. Though obviously, it wasn't just law enforcement who had failed Eloá in the situation, with many pointing their fingers at members of the media, especially those who directly interfered with the situation, as their behavior undoubtedly factored into Lindenberg's behavior. Though despite this, none of the journalists ever expressed any regret over their handling of the situation, and to my knowledge, none of them faced any form of repercussions. As a result of his many crimes, Lindenberg would be sentenced to 90+ years in prison, though due to Brazilian law, the sentence was reduced to just 30 years, making it likely that he will someday be released from prison. Which, for now, brings us to the end of this tragic story. Though there is one more detail about this case that I just had to mention at the end here, because it somehow makes this story even more bizarre, as just days after Eloá's death, her father Aldo would disappear. Throughout the entire hostage crisis, Aldo was essentially invisible to the public, as the press was forbidden from interviewing any of Eloá's family. But as a result of Nayara's recapture, Aldo had become so stressed that he collapsed and was rushed to the hospital. There, he would make a full recovery, but when he was carried away from the scene, the cameras would capture his image as he lay on a stretcher, with the photo being broadcast all over the news that day, where a detective at home just so happened to recognize him. As it turns out, Aldo was a wanted man, having been accused of murdering at least 2 people back in the 90s as part of a Brazilian gang, one of which was even a police chief, and from that moment he had been on the run ever since, with Aldo actually being an alias for his real name, Everaldo. During this whole situation, Eloá's father was quite literally a killer on the run, and he had been blending into his new life for over a decade, until the moment his face was broadcast all over Brazil, which in turn caused him to flee the area immediately after. Though eventually, after a full year later, Everaldo would finally be captured and sent to prison, marking the end of one of the most shocking television cases we've ever explored, and what may very well be the darkest moment in television history.